So welcome. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza. I'm the Director of Population, Environmental Change and Security here at the Wilson Center. And I'm excited to see so many people here today. When we thought about this session, we thought that we would have probably about 50 people, and we got about 150 RSVPs. So it's good to see that so many people are interested in this topic. And as I was riding into work this morning, I was thinking about this session today because I was in the metro and I pull out my iPod and I put on my NPR StoryCorps report, which I listen to on a regular basis on the train. And it reminds me how much storytelling has really come to the center now. It seems to be so popular. And with this session, we wanted to focus a little bit about what is the business of storytelling. Those of us who are involved in international development work, how can we harness the power of storytelling? How do we do this from a logistical and operational perspective? And what are the advantages and challenges in doing that? So our session focuses on narratives, research, and policy. And I think those components of storytelling is really good for us at the Wilson Center because, as many of you know, at the Wilson Center we focus on bringing together the worlds of analysis, policy, and programs to look at what are some opportunities for innovation and practical solutions. And that's done very much consistent with our mission as a living memorial to President Wilson, who really brought these issues together for us. Our event today is being sponsored by our HELPS project, which focuses on health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security, and is supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. And in the course of bringing those issues together, we specifically think about storytelling and what storytelling means, because we're dealing with very complex and complicated issues, and we're reaching out to a variety of audiences. We've been working with journalists. In fact, one of the journalists here today from Malawi will be working with us as we move to the annual meeting of the Society of Environmental Journalists to help U.S. journalists think about how these issues are connected globally and are important to bring to an American public. We work with a number of research institutions also, and we work in producing documentary films to convey these messages. So it's good to see these various elements reflected in today's panel. As I think about our discussion and our session today, I think about it in terms of what I'm thinking of now in terms of 3 P's of storytelling. And the first P for me is popularity. It seems, as I was saying now, storytelling is almost the new black. Everyone's talking about storytelling. It's very trendy, but yet we haven't always figured out how to do it. Is this something that we can just give over to a marketing department and say, come up with some good stories and let's get those out, and that will help us convey our message? Is that the right way? So I think about the popularity of storytelling and how we can build on that. The second P for me is the purpose of storytelling. What's the purpose? What are we hoping to get out of it? And there's a recent initiative that just released a report this week. It's called Working Narratives, and it talks about 4 purposes of storytelling. It says that storytelling is essentially to help us learn, to help communities assess needs and strengths and evaluate approaches. It talks about storytelling to help us organize, to build strength and leadership within an organization or movement, and serve as a way to exchange strategies for some social change. It talks about storytelling as a tool for advocacy, to engage diverse civil actors and large-scale constituency building, fundraising, and policy advocacy. And finally, it talks of storytelling as an opportunity to educate, to bring in a variety of large audiences in a civic dialogue and public education. And it seems to me in our discussions today, we will touch on those various goals and purposes of storytelling. And then finally, the final P for me is our panel today. I'm really excited it makes me think of how I know everyone on the panel. And I want to give a special shout out to an organization that I used to work with, Population Action International, that does a really excellent job of storytelling and how conveying messages around reproductive health being important to overall development efforts. And it was through my work at PAI that I've met all of these individuals at the panel today. Dingan Miti, who's a journalist from Malawi, and I have been in the trenches a number of times in Malawi, trying to really think about how do we develop stories around key climate change, reproductive health, and women's empowerment issues. And Dingan has had outstanding success in doing that work. He's a superstar journalist, and I'm thrilled to have him here with us today. Dr. Shamim, from Bangladesh, from Eminence in Bangladesh. As a matter of fact, we were in his offices last week in Dhaka, and as I met with Shamim, he said to me, Roger Mark, look at my office. You see that, that sheet and blanket and pillow on the floor in my office? I just slept there. So this is a CEO of an organization who is so committed to his work, he's actually spending the night in the office. I spoke to his wife about that. but Shamim really brings a really firm commitment to these issues and strong dedication to thinking about research and storytelling and to reach out to journalists. Gina and I were colleagues together at Population Action International. And you will see some wonderful maps that are very powerful and have been very powerful in conveying these key messages. And I remember sustained conversations that Gina and I have had about the power of data and maps and research to convey a story. So this is a little bit of what Gina will be talking about today. And Nathan and I collaborated with a number of colleagues at PAI on a film, a documentary film that brought together the issues of reproductive health, women's empowerment, and climate change. And that has been one of the most powerful films that I have had worked with, and constantly have people coming to me to ask about how this film was produced and how it has really served as a model for thinking about storytelling. So Nathan is going to talk a little bit about that. So a nice range, but I like that we have journalism, folks working on infographics, folks working on research visualization and thinking about how that fits into stories. I like that we have different geographies, Bangladesh, Malawi, the United States. So I'm hoping that we'll have a rich discussion that builds on the richness of the three Ps and the panel. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Nathan just to say a few words about his work, and then we'll have a couple quick examples of some of his outputs.
Great, thank you. So I'm primarily a cinematographer, and I work on a variety of formats. One is television documentary, one is narrative fiction, one is advertising and promotions, and the other one, which I spend the majority of my time on, is documentaries for NGOs, so advocacy documentaries essentially. And have worked a lot with NGOs, and it's a really fascinating relationship. Trying to tell a story, but also trying to get the message right so that everyone at that organization feels like their story's being told, but doing it in a way that is cinematic and is popular. So happy to talk about all those things while I'm here today.
So Jake, can I get someone to just help me get the two?
And actually, I should probably introduce these. These two examples that we're going to show you are very short films that I love because the filmmakers and the organizations, I feel like, took a really big risk to follow these storylines. I think traditionally NGOs really want to follow a formula when telling their stories. This is what we do, this is how we do it, these are our talking heads, this is someone in the field, etc. And I think there's far more powerful ways to do it. And there's a really big spectrum in terms of storytelling of ways that you can do it. So I think this first example is a really unique and powerful example of how you can do something different.
orang mana ya rekennya? Ada di ada. Ada nggak Meli? Lenda, lakukan dulu ya. Tapi dan orangnya. Negara kok, tengok entah sama kayaknya. Ada balik dengarnya dong ya. Nah, menurut dengarnya dong ya.
So Nathan, tell us a little bit about this. What was different about this for you?
Well, obviously there are a lot of different goals that organizations may have, and this one's very particular. It's they wanted to draw attention to their cause and to drive people to their website. But I think what this film does really well, it's not about unsafe drinking water. It's about this little boy. And I think that's an important lesson for almost any film and any organization, is that people will care about people. People will care about your subjects. People won't care about statistics. And this clearly makes the entire issue about this one little boy. So I think their major push with this ad was to get people to their website, which illustrates another great point, and that is a film is only one tool in your arsenal. One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of NGOs make is they want their film to do everything, and they just start loading it with information to the point of, it breaking the story, essentially. So if you can let your film do what film does really well, and that is communicate human stories, you can then get people to all of the other strategies that you have to understand what your organization does and get involved. This film in particular, I think, had hundreds of thousands of hits within the first few weeks. And it drove people to their website, and their donations went through the roof, and their brand visibility went through the roof. So it's just a great example of how to take those few key fundamentals of creating a film.
And it's interesting because the name of the organization doesn't really appear until the end. So talk a little bit about that.
Right. It's another great point. And in a lot of documentaries, people want, they really want to make their message and their people very clear, very present, and constantly on the screen. And a lot of times it's a little counterintuitive, because what works best is it's kind of a form of elegance. It's what you don't include in your film sometimes that really matters. And I think this was just as successful for what they didn't put in the film as it was for what they did put in it. And sometimes simplicity is really the best way to go. It's not necessarily talking heads and lower thirds and names and information. Sometimes it's just one 5-year-old boy that works better than anything else.
What's a lower third?
Lower third is just when they show someone's name and their position.
Okay. Any setup for this other clip?
I think it's very similar. It's a great example of how successful a project can be when you allow creativity to be your main driver in the project.
I probably would make a time machine.
I would make medicine for the sick.
I'd probably invent something new.
我会赢到5个总冠军戒指。
If I could have an extra 5 years to live.
You said 5, right?
5 years.
It's a long time.
I would try to fix everything I did bad.
I would bring my uncle back because I miss him very much.
I would get more hamsters.
I would probably want to go looking for dark matter.
I think I'd go looking for aliens.
If I could live an extra 5 years,
I was thinking about making like a helicopter, like a wooden helicopter, but I don't have any wood.
I want to go check out the moon sometime.
I'd probably teach my sister not to hate tuna.
I would try and invent a machine that lets you learn at light speed.
if I had 5 more extra years to live,
I would be the boss of all the chipmunks.
eu cantaria na frente de 1 milhão de pessoas.
I don't really know. I think I'd do anything. Why are you asking me that?
So, and can you talk a little bit about the reaction of this clip?
Yeah. Again, it's a very similar fundamental to the last film that we saw, and that is just make people care. And I think this one did something extraordinary with humor. It's a heavy subject, and it's a heavy message. And I think a lot of people would fear that humor would spoil their argument because it doesn't match the gravity of the subject. And I think they were able to do something really exceptional by just appealing to us as humans. We laugh, we have dark humor, people can very easily relate when they watch something like this because it makes you laugh and it also makes you, feel the emotion of the issue. And I think oftentimes that gets overlooked in NGO documentaries because people really want to get across their programmatic points, which can be really important. And again, I think it really depends on what your goals are. But I don't think you can overlook things like this. You can't overlook humor. You can't overlook those little moments in someone's life that make you feel attached to a character. You may be telling a documentary and you have a moment while your main subject is in the kitchen having tea. And through a facial expression or through an interaction they have with someone, you learn something about them, and maybe you even relate to them. You say, I do that with my kids, or I do that with my sibling, or whatever the case might be. And that could be something that people would look at and want to cut because it doesn't have anything to do with their issue. They say, well, this is dead time. I don't need this. This isn't talking about what I want you to talk about. But it's really important because it makes you care about that subject. And if you care about that subject, you care about their issue, and eventually the organization.
So forgive this question, but what's the deal with the kids? Do we all need kids to do stories?
I didn't realize that until I was sitting up here. Everyone's going to think that you need kids in your stories. Well, I mean, it's something that most people have a soft spot for, and I don't think there's anything wrong in being strategic about that in your films. Finding specific things that will make people sympathize.
What about, so you talk about sort of wanting to cut a dead issue. Talk a little bit about your relationship as an independent filmmaker and your clients. What are they looking for? What is that space like? What's difficult about that space? What do they not get? Right. What's your interests coming into this relationship as a filmmaker, and how do you reconcile that with these clients' interests and their need for an output or deliverable for their purposes?
Yeah, it's always a negotiation. When you work with a filmmaker, or for us when we're working with NGOs, our primary objective is to create something that people will care about, that also has enough context for people to be able to understand that issue. And oftentimes, for people who are working for NGOs, they're coming from a very different place. They're often coming from a place where they're talking a lot about research. They're working primarily with documents and PowerPoints and papers. And it sometimes can be really tricky to bridge that gap between something like what you just saw and that world that they spend most of their time in. And I think it usually ends up working pretty well because the filmmaker may push too far in one direction, and then the client is constantly trying to push back in the other direction. And typically, if you have an open discourse, you can find that middle ground. I think filmmakers will always try to push you to the human story, and they'll just keep hammering home those same points. And typically through that discussion, you settle in a pretty good place where your film has the emotion that it needs, but also has the information and the context to help people understand your issue.
So you talk about not including everything in the film, thinking about the human stories. What else do we in the development community need to be thinking of as we try to think about storytelling in this way? How can we better work with you? Sure. What's any suggestions for us?
One thing that I feel is overlooked a lot of the time is what happens once the film is done. So much energy goes into making these films because it's exciting. I mean, everybody loves to be a part of working on a film, unless some people have done it for a while and found it frustrating, which it can be. But I think what happens afterwards is just as important as the actual production. A lot of great work ends up buried on someone's website. And it's really hard because it's expensive as well to have a distribution plan after production. But
is production expensive too?
Production can be expensive as well.
Yeah. So for a short clip like what we've seen, can you give a ballpark figure?
I mean, these films could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. What we just watched. Uh-huh. Yeah, because there's so much prep and there's casting, and which isn't to scare anyone away because it doesn't have to be that expensive. But the distribution strategy is just as important because if no one ever sees it, what's the point? Okay. And the other one is just being, that I would encourage is just being open, just being flexible to do something that's a little bit dangerous. It's a bit of a risk because I think oftentimes those projects reap the most benefits.
So Nathan, it seems to me that there are more and more people who are calling themselves multimedia storytellers or digital storytellers or visual storytellers. And at the same time, I am seeing more and more very boring video of conferences, long interviews with very boring people, attempts to use video to cover politics. And, as my teenage son would say, huh? Really? So I mean, you talked a little bit about what video is good at. And I suspect that video is less good at some things, numbers, politics. Could you talk a little bit about what do you think we should not use video for? And talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, film and video is a medium to move people, like I've said. And the biggest danger you face when trying to create something successful is by overloading it with information. But I think there's a space in between there where you can include information, you can include infographics and maps, and still have a film be successful. But if you don't have that singular, powerful thread of a human story in it, you have video of a conference or something with lots of talking heads. It's a hard thing to get over, that you have all these experts for your organization, and most likely the best thing for your film is not to have any of them in it.
I mean, we're going to talk about that.
And I don't mean to say that's always the case, but sometimes it is, and it's really difficult for organizations to embrace that. But when they do, oftentimes they find their projects are successful.
So who's the right spokesperson? Who are the right spokespeople? And okay, good. Well, thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to move on to our second speaker, Gina. And Gina, you could you could stay there or you can come up there, whichever you prefer. Where do you feel more comfortable?
I feel like I'll come up there just
Yeah,
so I can
great.
see you.
Yeah. So Gina's going to tell us a little bit about Population Action International's mapping work.
And to advance, do you want me to just tell you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that'll be a hard thing to follow up. Nathan's an excellent filmmaker. He did a film for us as well called Weathering Change that was very well done. So thank you to him. So I'll just start talking about mapping population and climate change. I work at PAI, and I am the GIS specialist there. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how you can use mapping to tell stories. So just a basic outline of kind of the 4 areas I'll talk about is 1, finding the story in the data, and then 2, translating that story into maps. And then the last 2 are kind of components that we needed to consider when creating our mapping website. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we considered both of those aspects, both the research and advocacy divide that we have at PAI, and also how we could develop a tool that could support our Southern partners' advocacy efforts. So first, talking about the story that we were trying to tell. At PAI, we were creating traditional publications and realized that climate change findings scattered across different publications would be useful and compelling to show in one place. So we created the mapping website to really tell the story of climate change vulnerability and adaptation. So our maps really show or illustrate how climate impacts, demographic trends, and the need for contraception are likely to affect countries' abilities to adapt to climate change. So that's the basic story that we were trying to tell with the maps, but there are a lot of steps along the way that you need to go through to get there. And the first is actually compiling your data, and that is admittedly a very challenging thing to do, to find reliable and trustworthy data sets. And as I said, I am the GIS specialist at PAI, and GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, for those that don't know. A lot of people don't know what that means, but I basically, to kind of put it in the most basic terms, do computer-based mapping and analysis. So once we have the data collected, I basically take that, whether it be from an Excel table or a PDF table, and I bring that into the GIS software and I make maps from there. So after analyzing the data and creating a sequence of maps, we developed a simple combination or index system to isolate what we call population and climate change hotspots. And those are areas where population trends and climate change vulnerabilities critically overlap. So if you see, before I go into the story that these 3 maps will tell you, I just would like to point out that our mapping website had several maps of a lot of different variables, but our hotspot sequence is really our signature piece, so that's what I'm going to focus on in this here. But you'll see in the first map here that this shows that many countries' populations are growing rapidly as they are expected to experience high declines in agricultural production. And if you look at the next map, many of the same countries that are experiencing high population growth are also among those that are the least resilient to climate change. So if you go to the next map, this is our hotspots map. And the hotspots are countries that are experiencing all 3. Rapid population growth, high expected declines in agricultural production, and they are the least resilient to climate change. So these hotspots are really areas that indicate where greater attention needs to be paid to the relationships between population and climate change. And the effects of rapid population growth, high agricultural decline, and low resilience to climate change will pose challenges in many parts of the world. And you'll see we actually identify 30 population and climate change hotspots. And those 30 hotspots have an average population growth rate of 2.4%, which if left unchanged, means the population would double in less than 30 years. And then if you see the countries that have a dot, those are countries that also have a high proportion of women who wish to prevent or delay their next pregnancy but are not using a method of contraception. So when women do not have access to the family planning services they want and populations grow rapidly, their resilience to climate change can be strained. So our story here is that if you invest in health programs that meet family planning needs, you could slow population growth, improve health and well-being, and reduce vulnerabilities to climate change impacts. So now that you have kind of the story that our hotspot series tells, I'd like to touch on those last 2 components, the first one is talking about the research advocacy divide. At PAI, we are an advocacy organization, but we have a very strong research department that supports those advocacy efforts. And so there's often a challenge between striking the right balance between a research product and an advocacy tool. So when developing our mapping website, the research department really wanted to have users be able to get the full range of data variables and choose which ones to overlay and have all of the information out there. Whereas for advocacy purposes, it's really best to have your messages clear and accessible to users so that they aren't left trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together to really figure out what the key takeaways are. And for us, we feel like the mapping website really was a good balance of the two, because in our first iteration of the mapping website, we had two sections. One was called Explore, which really catered to the research side, which allowed users to choose whatever variables they wanted to see mapped. And we also had a tour section, which was guided and had maps that we pre-selected with key messages and really helped tell the story to the user. And additionally, I think it's a good balance as well, because we're not trying to we're not running statistical models and we're not trying to show causality, but we're really trying to show the linkages and the relationships between these population and climate change variables in a way that's easy for people to understand. And as a GIS specialist, of course, I'm going to plug the map. Maps, I feel like, are inherently compelling because they contain a high resolution of information, and most people have really been trained since grade school on how to read a map. So they really have this unique ability to convey complex and intricate messages in a way that's easy for people to understand. And finally, the last piece that we had to consider was supporting our Southern partners. At PAI, we do a lot of advocacy work with our Southern partners, and we wanted to make sure that we were developing a tool that would be useful for their advocacy efforts in country. So initially, we just did the global mapping, the global hotspots and the other variables. But we wanted to take a deeper dive and show things on a subnational level. So we created 5 country profiles, and before doing that, we polled our partners and asked them what they thought would be useful to have mapped, and also what functionalities of the website they would like to see. Like, will you be printing these? Do you want PDF fact sheets based on this? What really would be useful to you? So after polling them, we really used that information to inform both the content and design of our website. So there it is. Hopefully I didn't go over 5 minutes in a nutshell, but open to questions also.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you. So you can.
Sure.
So Gina, this is wonderful because it's an example of a story, but also an opportunity where you're empowering others. You're providing a tool and giving them an opportunity to tell that story. So there are a couple of elements that come to mind for me. There's a loss of control over the story and the narrative because you're providing a tool, and who knows how these people will be using this tool. So talk a little bit about how your Southern partners interacted with the map. How did they find it useful? Were there things that you didn't expect? Were there questions that surprised you? Talk a little bit about providing a storytelling tool that you're hoping to hand over to others in the South to use.
Well, one of the biggest challenges actually was that internet connectivity kind of limited our partners' use of the mapping website, which is not something that I think we thought about right off the bat. So the technology and the medium that you use is important, but that allowed me to work one-on-one with partners to create custom maps that they requested. And there were also challenges there because I think a lot of times my definition of data might be different than someone else's definition of data. So for example, somebody might request that I overlay something with the roads in a particular country, the road network. And so they'd send me an image file of the roads. But I can't bring that into my GIS software because I need something that's tied to a particular location. So often there was a challenge of kind of a mutual understanding of terms, but it was great to be able to customize maps and send them over to our partners to make sure that they were getting things that were effective. But again, the initial website was a bit problematic due to the internet connectivity issues. We've just recently launched a new version that uses more flexible and up-to-date technology that really can help alleviate some of those issues. There are a lot of software programs out now that can do bandwidth detection and notice kind of what internet speed you're using and can adjust the maps accordingly. So there's a lot has changed since we launched initially in 2009.
And so it's also a field that's currently evolving.
It is,
so.
yeah. And so, I mean, that kind of leads to kind of some of the lessons learned and best practices, I would say that investing in a technology that's flexible enough for you to update it in-house and make changes when you need to is really important. Initially, when we launched the website in 2009, there really weren't tools that were robust enough or affordable for us to be able to kind of do that on our own. So we hired a developer to build the website basically from the ground up and then incorporate our maps into that website. But now, as I said, there are a lot of tools for people who even don't have mapping backgrounds. Tableau Public is a really good free tool. There are free GIS softwares like QGIS. There's ArcGIS Online. And the one that we used most recently was Mapbox or TileMill. They go hand in hand. And those are a lot more flexible and easy for people to use and a lot less expensive.
So one of the things that is appealing for me with this, Gina, is I think at PAI you're trying to reach new audiences and build new champions around reproductive health, family planning, and women's empowerment. So you're connecting these issues to climate change and presenting it in maps that could appeal to environmentalists, for example. Could you talk a little bit about any of your thoughts about how this helps you reach out to different and new audiences? Are you getting, with this kind of product, has it helped PAI advance its goal of reaching out to new audiences or any other PAI goals?
Yeah, I feel like the map was really successful for moving our work forward. When it first launched, the maps actually received quite a bit of media attention, including coverage from Andy Revkin and Nick Kristof from the New York Times, and in its first year had over 40,000 visitors. And what it really did was allowed us to introduce this idea of a population and climate change hotspot into these conversations that people were having in these separate silo development areas like population or environment, and allowed us to really show the linkages to groups that maybe we hadn't worked with before or that hadn't worked on our issues either.
So Gina, you started talking about the importance of data and sort of the research and advocacy departments at analyzing this data. I know in the past I have come to you and said, well, we have this great story we want to tell. Let's find a way to do this. And you've come back to me and said, the data is not available, Roger Mark. And I know that I've heard this from other colleagues. You come up with this wonderful story that you want to find a way of telling, but the data or the information isn't really there to support it in the way that you're thinking of. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you work through that? How do you sift through those ideas and get to a story that you can present that is credible, authentic, and evidence-based?
I think it depends on what we mean when we say that the data isn't there. If we're talking about a country that's lacking a statistic for a particular variable that other countries do have available, then there's a story in that. There's a story in there being no data, especially in the areas of health. If these countries or organizations, whoever's responsible for gathering that information, are not doing so, then that's a story. But if we're talking about, in the other sense, that the data exists, but it's just not painting the picture that we want it to paint, then I would definitely explain and convey to my colleagues that we can't say things about the data that's not that aren't there.
Right.
And I think, especially as researchers and advocates, it's our duty to be responsible with that information and not tell stories that aren't there. But quite honestly, from a process aspect, I would really recommend starting with the data and seeing what story it tells, instead of starting with the story and then trying to get data to fit that story. And oftentimes, if you look at the data first, you may find that it tells a completely different but also compelling story that you may not have thought about before.
Great. Thank you, Gina. So let's move now to Dr. Shamim, who's going to tell us a little bit about ways to present evidence to help change a story in Bangladesh. Shamim?
Thank you, Roger. I will talk about a story from a country called Bangladesh, which is about 160 million people. And the geographical area of this country is same as the state of Iowa in USA. And this is the country where you will find a highly densely populated country. And the story about Rohima, you can see Rohima is trying to get some shrimp phrase for her livelihood. And she is 27 years old, and she has 2 children, and now she is pregnant in second trimester. And her father and her husband lives in urban areas for their livelihood to do the daily labor as like rickshaw pulling. And she is doing this thing for her own livelihood. And when we talk with her that what she did for her pregnancy, and she said that she took only 1 antenatal care due to she could not find her health center, which was just few months ago in a village which just destroyed by the flood in that area. And you know that this area is a coastal based area in Bangladesh, and we are expecting that this area will be gone underwater within the next few years. And if you look at her situation, that she wanted to get her antenatal care, but there is no antenatal care center in that area. And she has to, if she wants to take antenatal care, she has to move for few miles to get the services, and that center is called Upojela Health Complex, and she cannot go there within this second trimester period. And there is nobody in her family except her mother and 2 siblings in her family. And this evidence and this story tell you that what is happening in our country for the maternal health services. And if you look at the other evidence, when we did the study, we found that the hypertension among the women in that area is very high, because the salinity water is very high, and people are taking the water which has very high salinity. And you know that women who has taking the regular salinity water, they have some sort of high blood pressure. And we found that in that region, most of the women has high blood pressure, and most of the women are dying due to this pre-hypertensive condition and hypertensive condition during this pregnancy. And at this moment, we have 194 maternal mortality rate per 100,000 live birth. And in this situation, when we talk with her that how do you like to see for your healthcare services, and she said that she wants to move from that area for a good life, and she said that if she get an opportunity to go to other places to have a better access of the health services, who has a better access of the livelihood, then she can easily spend her life in near future. Can we go to the next slide? And if you look at her face, she is malnourished, and she does not have any proper nutrition status, and even she is thinking about that what she has to do for the next day for her livelihood. Can you go to the next slide? And this is her 2 children with her 2 siblings. Those are thinking to have a better life in near future, better education, and she's thinking that if government come up to help them, then they can get better life in near future. So I'm just going to stop here by describing this story in Bangladesh for a maternal health services in the effect of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamim. So a few things that really stood out for me. You talked about your comments as evidence is the strongest tool to change the story. What do you mean by change the story? Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is there an existing story out there? There's a misperception about that story. You're trying to create a different narrative. Talk a little bit about this element of changing the story.
As you know that Bangladesh is most vulnerable country for climate change, and the maternal health and reproductive health also very vulnerable. But in terms of linking this maternal health and climate change issue, we did not get any initiative in our country before we started this type of generating evidence. Very interesting things regarding our methodology. When we started this research, we developed a technical group, and we included several journalists within our technical group. And the research when we did, we identified these cases, and we shared these cases within our technical group. And that's story actually translated into the mass media, and as well as in the other medias, which came to our policymakers who cannot really understand the different scientific evidence and other things. So it gives them very good understanding to understand about the problem and bring some sort of initiative for the community. So I think this is the something in a story, if you can really translate into the policymakers, that can give a better chance for getting better outcome.
So it's very good to hear about this idea of the technical group, the journalists, the mass media, sort of this becoming a story that was taken up. I was quite struck by this image for a number of reasons. Number one, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that she's pregnant. Number two, you don't see her face. Number three, the image is a little bit fuzzy. So to me, I come away from this image thinking this is not just about one woman, it's about the condition of several women, Bangladeshi women, and you very clearly see the high vulnerability. The question that it raises for me is, so is Rohima's message then taken up by this technical group, taken up by journalists, taken up by you as the CEO of Eminence? Is her voice being heard? Who is the messenger here? Whose story is it? And how do you, as the CEO of an NGO working on these issues, try to figure that out? Who are your spokespeople, and how do you remain true to Rohima and her message?
When we did this study, this type of stories we collected by our researchers, then within our Eminence we have a communication team who actually make this type of story accessible for the policymakers. And we also regularly write up in the newsletter and other mass media. Also, we write up in the blog to disseminate this type of information. And when we started this research, that time we did not have initiative. And within this 2 years' time, government taken some sort of initiative, like in our health ministry, they put a component called the climate change unit. And they put some resources to do further activities for the health and climate change issues. And recently you will find that other stakeholders in our country who used to work on the climate change and environment issues, they did not actually included the health issues. So you will find a very vibrant situation at this moment in Bangladesh to link up with the health, reproductive health issues with the climate change. So it is very, now in a very good situation, and we think that, government and other stakeholders would come forward not only to generate evidence, also to implement some program too.
So, earlier when we were chatting with Nathan talked about experts, and the experts who are the ones telling the story. And do you ever combine your efforts of having your communications department and other spokespeople working with people in the communities who are telling their own stories? Is there any way that you try to work in that context?
Yep. What we actually do that, we have a communication team, as well as we are working with the journalists too. So like recently we are developing a guideline how you can translate the scientific evidence into the popular media. So that guideline, we are giving training to the journalists so they can really bring this type of story into the popular media. On the other hand, we always try to make some sort of story, as well as you will find that we are always vibrant in Facebook and other social medias. I can tell you that from our organization, one person now, she's going to Australia to talk in TED Talk about the stories. You will find that we have a cancer related support group, and we are now using our social media, Facebook, to tell about the real story, day-to-day update of a cancer survivor, a cancer warrior. So these type of stories, we are trying to bring the real life stories, as well as, we are also organizing different seminars and symposium, bringing the people from the community and telling the stories in front of other, stakeholders and audience and policymakers too.
It sounds as if it's going well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Shamim, one of the things that I also wonder is about the specificity of Bangladesh. So it's a predominantly Muslim country. You are covering issues about reproductive health, maternal health, women's empowerment. You're also working quite hard on issues around climate change. Is there anything about Bangladesh in particular that that makes storytelling more difficult or more easy? Anything that's really specific to Bangladesh?
I think Bangladesh also a story, itself a story. If you look at our human resources, the population size, on the other hand, our resources, and if you look at our achievement the last 40 years, this time we are, moving towards to achieve the MDGs goal, without any resources, I think Bangladesh itself giving us some sort of positive deviance that we can really move. So I think this type of story of the positive, deviance can give you very strong feelings that we can really move. Just giving an example, as you said, the Muslim country. If you look at the, access to the health services, you will find that we have some sort of, other religion like Hindus, and their access is very low compared to the Muslims people. If you look at who are earning money for our country, you will find that Muslim women who are working in the garments, they are actually bringing our GDP. So it is not a question about the religion; it is a question about the women empowerment, women education. I think we are still a little bit behind about the women empowerment and women education, as we have 50% of men and women. So if you can really bring this women as settle up in a strong women empowerment and women education, Bangladesh will move forward.
Great, and with your good work, you continue to put Bangladesh on that path. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. So I'd like to go on to our last speaker, Dingan, and I would like to just share with you that Dingan has actually just gotten off the plane. He's literally just landed from Malawi at about 9 o'clock this morning, went to the hotel and came here. And he's still standing. So, those tough journalists. So thank you, Dingan, for making the trip and being here with us and engaging with us this week as we move to the Society of Environmental Journalists. So why don't you tell us your untold stories from Malawi?
I think I'll stand.
Sure.
Oh. What a lively audience. Good afternoon to you all. I want the figure. Good afternoon once again. Okay.
Storytelling right there,
All right, my name is Dingan Miti. I describe myself as a writer. I'm a journalist. I'm also a civil society activist. In short, Journalists Association Against AIDS, JONAIDS, is one of the few media NGOs operating in Malawi. We've got about 6 members of staff with a board. It's an organization which is very much dedicated to advancing population health and environment. And one aspect is Malawi is a very small country. We are in Southern Africa, sharing border with Zambia. Malawi is only 115,000 square kilometers. You can calculate. But the population is about 15 million. Very small country with very high, rapid population growth. So what we are trying to do this morning is to tell the story of Malawi. For information, I think some of you have heard about Dr. Kamuzubanda. Have you ever heard Dr. Kamuzubanda, the founding president of Malawi? He was a strong man. He was a dictator. He ruled Malawi for 31 years. Around 1985, he said, I don't want family planning in this country. We're coming from a history whereby we have not done very well in family planning. And that is why you see the slide there, you see the story talking about realigning family planning in the national agenda, because this is what we want to do right now. And that particular story was generated on the 22nd of May last year. Population Reference Bureau, USAID, they sponsored the first national leaders conference on family planning for the first time in Malawi. So we had members of parliament, politicians, the media, and different civil society organizations. So why are we trying to talk about this? Why are we trying to highlight these features in the papers? It's very critical because, one, when we do these stories frequently in the print media, for example, you keep the debate alive. Because we know that politicians, political leaders, they read newspapers frequently. The more you write, you ignite that debate and keep these leaders on their toes, because we need to hold them accountable on their promises. And since 1984, when we had that international the International Conference on Population Development, I think that one was hosted by Egypt in Cairo. For example, in Malawi, the national population policy had expired around the year 2000, but it took time until only last year it's when it was approved. But because there was a lot of pressure in the media, a lot of stories were coming out to say, why are you delaying? Why are you not approving this policy? So if you look at Malawi right now is faced with environmental degradation, agricultural decline, and the rapid population growth. And according to the projections, by the year 2050, the Malawi's population is going to triple, almost to 40 to 50 million. Right now, we're talking about 15 million. Very small country. It's very worrisome. The other issue for Malawi, we find that Malawi, the hydroelectric capacity in Malawi is just very small. Since 1964, when we got independence, the machinery wasn't overhauled up to now. And that's why we find every day blackout. And I'm wondering, we're having power. I can't see blackout here. So, wow. But in Malawi, blackouts, we are used to them. We are used to that. So you look at power blackouts. What impact do they have? People are driven to use charcoal. People who are living in urban areas, that rapid urbanization drives people to use a lot of charcoal because people are afraid of electricity bills which are not reasonable anyway. So there are a lot of things happening. So the article also highlights the role of researchers, CSOs, international NGOs, for example, Population Reference Bureau, and PRIB has been very critical in Malawi to bring leaders, politicians to the table to keep talking about population health and environment, because this is what has been missing in Malawi for a long time. And the other problem with politicians, for example, members of parliament, they think when you have a lot of numbers of people, you are talking about votes. So if you talk about family planning, it's something which is the opposite. I think you get my point. If you tell a member of parliament to say, because like right now in Malawi, the fertility rate for Malawi is 5.7%, meaning that a woman on average has got 6 children. Now looking at the rate, how this population is growing in Malawi, we want to come to an ideal scenario whereby maybe a woman has got 2-3 children. She needs to be healthy. She needs to be in a position to look after the children very well. But the other challenge is Malawian women are not empowered to accessing education because education is also very key to scaling up family planning. So just Banda there, and there's also another colleague that side. I think maybe some of you can recognize that woman. You know that one? So Joyce Banda, that's our current head of state. She's the second female president in Africa. The first one is Ellen Sirleaf Johnson of Liberia. She's the second. Right now, as I'm talking, Malawi has committed itself to scale up family planning by creating a budget line for family planning in the national health budget, something which never happened before. So to us, the media, we feel this is a very huge score. We kept on talking about these things, writing more stories in the newspapers. And the other very interesting thing is when these stories come out in the papers, radio stations also pick up these particular stories, and also they run phone-in calls. People keep talking about these issues. So we feel it is very vital. And you see that poster there, no man should die, or giving life. Everyone has a role to play. That particular billboard is one of the messages relating to the acceleration of the campaign to reducing maternal mortality. And Malawi, the maternal mortality rate is about 675 per 100,000. Of course, we're hearing stories that the maternal mortality is declining a little bit. But looking at Malawi has never been in a conflict. Looking at 675 per 100,000, it is very alarming. And we feel, as the media, we've got a very huge role to play to sensitize the whole nation and also to make sure that political leaders are held accountable. And the only way is to write about these stories. Write more stories will make sure that the leaders are listening. And that's a message we're trying to deliver.
Great. Thank you, Dingan. So Dingan, and just to clarify, so these billboards, there was actually a billboard that said family planning conserves natural resources. And these were billboards that the government was putting up, and there was one billboard with the president's face, right? So, but you asked the question, I'm not sure that you gave the answer. Who's this other individual here?
That woman? I think I'll look through to find out. You'll get an answer soon.
Yeah. So it's Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates, right?
She's from here, actually. So
yes.
So I thought you know her. Okay. Right.
So Dingan, thanks very much. I was quite struck by a couple of things that you said. You introduced yourself as a writer and a journalist, and almost in the same breath, you said you're a civil society activist. And you followed that up by saying the more you write, the more you ignite. So tell us a little bit more about how you reconcile your role as a journalist and telling these stories with your social activism. How do you bring all of these together? Do you ever get accused of being too strong of an activist? And do people question your reporting because of it?
I think that is a very good question. In Malawi, if you are a writer, if you are a journalist, when you try to pick out a certain issue, you write more about it. People think you have got a hidden motive. You are advancing a certain agenda. And that creates a problem somehow. And when you talk about population health and environment, it's an issue which keeps most political leaders on their toes, always. But it's something to do with commitment. Because we have got different, for example, the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, for example. It's one of those commitments which, as the media, we are monitoring. And the more you write about it, it's like you are trying to point a finger at a certain political leader that something is not working very well. So you can see that one, that you are towards a collision course somewhere. You want to highlight something, but some political leaders are not very happy. And actually, one of the stories which I was showing there, I got about 5 phone calls from top officials in the Ministry of Economic Planning. Of course, three of them were congratulating me to say, no, good story. But the other 2 were saying, but somehow it's like you are doing this too much. So it's not all people who are happy when they see this particular type of stories. You are trying to maintain a balance, but at the same time, you are inviting trouble, because politicians are not happy when you're talking about this frequently. They know that you are trying to point there's a certain policy failure, something is not working very well. So to make sure that we keep these stories coming out, balance them very well, it is not very easy. It's a challenge, because population health and environment, it's a complex issue, highly complex. Because at the same time, people still are not understanding how population health and environment, in Malawi it's a new concept, people don't really understand, but the only best way is to make sure that when you are digesting these stories, my own experience is when I'm writing these stories, for example, I have to contextualize the particular field. For example, the issue of charcoal burning. I've talked about the low capacity in terms of hydroelectric power in Malawi. Many people in urban areas are running towards charcoal. What impact does that have on deforestation, for example? And this rapid population growth. So we're trying to dig stories which are typical, they give a human face, and that's what we want. That human face, actually, is the one which brings more impact.
So I know organizations like the Compton Foundation here in the United States talk about transformational leadership and courageous storytelling. So it's very much some of the topics that you touch upon. And I know from my work with you that you are not operating in a vacuum. It's the Journalist Society against AIDS. So you yourself are covering these as a journalist, but you're also providing support to a network of journalists. And I believe you also conducted a media audit to get a sense of how other journalists are engaging in courageous storytelling. Tell us a little bit more about what's happening with journalists in Malawi. Are they able to tell these kinds of stories? What did you find from that audit? What are you helping your other journalist colleagues to do?
I remember very well, that was in February 2012. The United Nations Population Fund, they gave us a grant to train the local media on reporting population dynamics and climate change, and also to conduct a media audit on population dynamics and climate change. What we found out is capacity amongst the journalists to report on population health and environment is lacking. It's a very huge challenge because of the complexities of population dynamics. For example, migration, population dynamics, for example, like urbanization, age structure. These dynamics, they're very complex, and to tell a story about them, it is not very easy. So the other compelling finding was that we need to support the media to make sure that they keep on reporting on these issues. And the other challenge we found out in the media audit is most journalists, they don't know how to access this particular type of information. Where are the sources exactly to get the stories so that they're able to report accurately and effectively, in the sense that sometimes they don't cause confusion. Because in the media in Malawi, I've seen that type of sensationalism whereby you find stories which tend to create alarm, where maybe there's no any need. It's a very huge challenge. And that's why maybe in Malawi you see in newspapers frequently, you see corrigenda. I think you are aware, you know what a corrigenda is all about. When an editor is retracting a story, something which was untrue, so you are trying to correct, to say that we're sorry, this is not the right way we reported. We are giving an apology. We see these type of stories coming out frequently because sometimes journalists are in a rush. They don't do research on stories. So that audit really found out to say that the capacity in the media is lacking. And what we're doing right now is to continue engaging the media, train them, give them all the resources, like Population Action International. They've supported us a lot. We've got a lot of material even Population Reference Bureau, like giving us a lot of documents. So we're able to disseminate online. And also we've got a resource center at our office in Lilongwe, Malawi's capital, where journalists come from different media houses to access these materials. And right now we're seeing that at least there's a marked improvement in reporting, unlike in the past. But we feel there's a lot of work to do.
So one of the things that I do wonder about, you talk specifically about the president, Joyce Banda, who has created this family planning budget line. You have folks like Melinda Gates going to Malawi to meet with the president. Does this make reporting on these issues easier? Does that help or does it not?
Right now it helps. I can say it helps because once a leader like Joyce Banda, she becomes open. Of course, herself, she runs her own maternal health foundation, Joyce Banda Safe Motherhood Foundation. She uses that platform to advance maternal health in Malawi. It becomes a bit easier because now she's open. She's able to talk to journalists in different ways, unlike in the past. Because if you remember earlier on in my speech, I've talked about our former head of state, the founding father, Dr. Kamuzu Banda, banning family planning. So once a leader opens the way, it also creates that leeway for different types of civil society, including the media, to start opening up to report. So right now, we're seeing that the media is opening up. But the only challenge is that issue the issue to do with capacity. So that one is still an obstacle. But right now, I can confidently say that the media is now becoming opened up to report on population health and the environment. So really political commitment and political will is very critical towards population health and environment. Sure.
So again, one last question before we open it up for questions. And I wonder, as a journalist, if you could reflect a little bit about the role of a journalist as a storyteller in the context of the evolving field of journalism. It seems to me that more and more there's such a high flow of information. There are platforms that enable communities to share what they know, and that's being reported as journalism. There's crowdsourcing. Journalism can be a stream. There's Twitter. There's a snapshot of current knowledge, Wikipedia. How does all of this come together in a country like Malawi? And is journalism and journalistic reporting changing, evolving in a country like Malawi? And if it is, how are you positioning yourself as an activist, a journalist, and a storyteller in that context?
I think being a storyteller and at the same time being a journalist, we are seeing that the digital world is evolving. And like maybe 10, 15 years ago, this revolution of the social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and these other types of social media, they didn't exist. But right now, as a storyteller, you need to keep with time. You need to be kept abreast with these new media. So Facebook is one of those very key social media platforms in Malawi, which we're also using as an organization. We've got a special Facebook page, which we've just created, I think some 3-4 months ago, whereby we're trying to engage civil society activists, the media themselves, researchers, and other groups to make sure that we keep talking on population health and environment. And the other issue is that being a journalist, I think you are at the center stage whereby you are trying to tell the story, not only telling the story, but you also have to give it a human face, as I said earlier on. Because sometimes the problem with our media in Malawi, most journalists, they will simply report and throw the story without even following up. Because follow-ups are very critical to maintain the rhythm when you are reporting. So as a storyteller, you need to make sure that you are able to make follow-ups which are rigorous, and make sure that you are able to tell a story which is compelling and which is given a human face. So issues to do with family planning. For example, we went to the Lower Shire of Malawi. The Lower Shire, we've got a very big river in Malawi which flows into Lake Malawi, and then Lake Malawi also flows to the Indian Ocean. The Lower Shire is one of those, is an area which is very vulnerable to climate change, and every year there's perennial flooding. And one compelling story we found in the Lower Shire is that women have got 5 to 6 children in a family. They have got very large family sizes. And normally, you find that women are on the receiving end because they're the ones struggling to take care of children, or their husbands are very far away looking for other jobs, maybe in urban areas, basically. So in that particular scenario, we go to a flood-prone area like the Lower Shire in Malawi. As a journalist, you need to make sure that you are able to give a human face to a story and ensure that you embrace this new media, which is evolving. I think that is very essential.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much again. So let's open it up. Let's hear what questions you have, what points you'd like to make. Just a reminder, we are webcasting the session live. So when my colleagues come to you with a question, please be sure to speak in the mic, introduce yourself, and give your affiliation, please. So we have a question here.
Thank you. My name is Sasha. I'm at the State Department. This question was directed more toward Nathan, but I would welcome an answer from everybody. It's really inspiring what you're doing. My question is, how do you keep it fresh so that it doesn't become a formula, which of course inhibits the creativity?
Okay, I'll take a couple of questions. I think we have one in the back, and then Kat.
Hi, my name's Fairley from the Stimson Centre. Just wanted to thank the panel for some really interesting perspectives. My question is about the danger of storytelling, because storytelling, it resonates as a word, it's safe. We think of bedtime stories, but telling stories colloquially also means telling lies. So how can we negotiate that? The danger of misrepresenting the personal as generalizable, the danger of consent. Stories are not out there to be scooped up with a butterfly net. They're about someone, by someone, for someone. Who? And how do you negotiate that? And then finally, imagery. Lots of the stories that we're telling seem to rely on established imagery around helplessness, victimhood, poverty. How do you tell an effective story that doesn't also reproduce that imagery, sometimes by contradicting it or appearing to contradict it? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then we'll take one more question. We'll respond and then come back for more questions.
Thank you. My name's Kat Lazaroff. I'm from Resource Media, and imagery is actually what my question is about. We did a study of how nonprofits are using imagery versus how corporations are using them, and found out that in general, with some clear exceptions of these fantastic videos and the GIS work that PAI has done, that imagery is often an afterthought. It's really under-resourced, and yet I saw some good pictures in the presentations from Dingan and Dr. Shamim. So I was curious, given that you work in resource-limited organizations, what do you put into imagery and how do you think about it? And by the way, we've got some postcards out on the table that are the results of the study we did and some tips on using imagery and storytelling for NGOs.
Great, thank you very much. So 3 great questions. Nathan, do you want to start?
Sure. I'll start with the how to keep it fresh. And I think it ties into what was said about new media. There are just so many different ways to tell stories now. You can do it through photo slideshows, you can do it through infographics, you can do it through short films, long films, animations, cartoons. There are just so many different ways to do it. And I think as storytellers, we're all constantly trying to keep track of that and ways to utilize new formats to tell stories in a compelling way so that it doesn't get tired. And I think some of you have probably seen some of the interactive pieces that the New York Times has been doing lately. I think over the last 6 months, they've come out with a few that are just incredible. And I was really astounded about how engaged I was with this interactive web story. I mean, I was just into it as I would be a short film. So I think it's really important both for organizations and storytellers to keep track of what's happening. When you see a good story, note what format that's in, and find new and creative ways to mix them too. I think people are doing awesome stuff with Instagram and things like that to get their message out in a way that hasn't been done before. And I also wanted to address the question about the pitfalls of telling stories. And I don't think I don't have a lot of specific answers for you beyond saying you have to be honest. You have to do your best to portray the stories as honestly as you possibly can and do your homework. It can become problematic using the victim imagery that you mentioned, but what do you do when there's a victim in the story? I mean, I would never try to change my image to avoid the story that someone is telling me. And oftentimes there are stories where you have to ask that question. Do you see yourself as a victim of these circumstances? And if people say yes, I think as a storyteller it's important that that's part of your story. But again, I just think you try to be as honest with your subject as possible. And someone mentioned that sometimes it's a bad thing to go in and say, this is the story we're going to tell. I think particularly for short form documentaries and long form documentaries, you go in with your organization, your client's agenda. You know what you're looking for, but you still have to ask people, is this the case? What are you experiencing? How does this affect your life? And then I know one of the toughest parts for me as a filmmaker has been coming back to a client and saying, things are a little different than the picture that you want to paint. And you had mentioned that as well, and you as well, that you have to be true to that story, whether it's exactly what you were being paid to come back with or not. Does that get most of it?
It's tough. Gina?
I guess I'll add a little bit to the first question about keeping it fresh. I'll admit that when I started at Population Action International, my position was almost exclusively around the mapping website and has since grown into something a lot larger about data visualization in general. And so I think keeping your organization flexible and willing to learn new things is really important because we've kind of adapted to the new things that are coming out. I mean, infographics are really big right now, so we've produced some of those and just try to change with the times. And in doing that, there are really easy ways, even using some of the new tools like Pinterest or Twitter to follow particular organizations. There are data visualization organizations. There are things that, whenever I see something where I like a design, I will capture that and try to remember it. New softwares, like I've mentioned, Tableau Public is something that I didn't know before I started there. I learned and taught myself. Same with Mapbox and TileMill. It's, I think, about being open to new technologies and new changing digital media and being willing to kind of learn that yourself and teach it to yourself and join working groups and build professional networks where you can learn and share from learn and share your own experiences about techniques, ideas, and data sources.
Shamin?
Yep. I think for refreshment and innovative and creative things for storytelling, I think for Bangladesh, when we started to talk about the storytelling, we found that we started the storytelling about the non-communicable diseases. Then we found that this is so effective that we can utilize for climate changes. Then we found that we can utilize it for the nutrition and food security problem. So, every day we are finding that we have lots of problem, and this is so interactive and so effective, then we can use it in different areas. So it is always, we found it more innovative, more creative. Just giving an example, like in our country, we used to do the DHS called Demographic and Health Survey, Bangladesh Demographic and Health Survey, and this is the fifth time we have done. And last fourth time, always when they disseminate the report, they just giving the bar chart and other things. Then we discussed with the USA that can we just put the behind how we collected the data. And they agreed, and we collected the photograph and we shared that photograph, what is the situation we had to collect the data. And after that dissemination, we found that everybody liked it. So this is something, we try to push always to give a new idea to talk about the storytelling. And the dangerous side, as you said, of the storytelling, I think as my friend shared that, sometimes the story is too negative for the politicians. So it becomes, sometimes very danger for us, But as a committed advocacy team, we found that this is also a very strong team to motivate the politician. So we are really, focused and committed and try to give them understanding that this is real problem, then they become motivated. And last thing regarding the, within the limited resources, how we do it, we found the storytelling is cost effective. You can just put a story and give the whole idea to the policymakers. Generating evidence and other things and doing dissemination and advocate, storytelling is very cost effective. Though filmmaking, sometimes you may find that it is very costly, but if you look at the outcome of a storytelling, it is really cost effective, we found. So we agree that storytelling is a very good effective tools for any advocacy.
And just to echo what my colleague here said, I think it's very cost effective. For example, the features we produce in Malawi, like one we have seen in the PowerPoint presentation, doesn't cost anything. You just have to flip through your photo database and also look through the work you have been doing, your case studies, and you turn them into a journalistic style whereby you generate features. Because the other challenge in Malawi is that features are lacking. And I find that in our daily papers in Malawi, the content of features comes from sources like Reuters, BBC, even IPS. I think some of you know IPS, Interpress Service. Features which are locally generated are lacking. So I think it's a duty for NGOs like us that even if we have limited resources, we have to strive for the best and generate a lot of stories which are compelling and also can bring a strong case to our policymakers to act. Thank you.
Okay, let's get some more questions. I think we have. Let's get a couple here.
Thank you very much. This is Maruf. I'm also representing Eminence from Bangladesh. Just I have one question for Nathan and one for Gina. The question is, since you were telling a story and the meaning actually plays out at three levels: at individual level and the community level. The community from which the subject is selected, and at the policy community level. The larger audience level. So my question is how to as a filmmaker or as a storyteller, how to negotiate the meaning between these three planes. Like you have three different planes to tell the whole thing. So and for Gina, it's for storytelling, the tools. One of the advantages of these tools is that the storyteller has some kind of engagement, direct engagement with the reality they are talking about. But for when you are constructing a story with infographics and other tools, with maps, then and you are using basically data collected by others, then you have a kind of disengagement with the reality. Then how to negotiate with this situation? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's get your question.
My name is Deirdre Lepin, University of Pennsylvania. Thanks to the panelists. This is fascinating. Many years ago, I did my PhD thesis on storytelling in Africa. And one of the things I learned very quickly was that there were traditional genres of stories. There are different types of stories. And one of the things that struck me right now is that we've got at least 4 different, very diverse types of stories we're talking about. We're talking about the Aristotelian type of story, Nathan's fictional, imaginary story, the type of thing that the poetics discusses. We've got stories that are really issues and analysis, and we have stories that are essentially accounts of things that actually happened. And then you have this, well, going back to analysis, a map, which is a story in itself. Now, every story really has this dual structure. It's, a story about what's going to happen next. It draws you into a human experience. But it's also an analysis. It also carries a lesson, which is deductive reasoning through the story. So this is a little bit complicated, but I wanted to ask the panelists how you choose the genre that you're going to use in connection with the subject that you want to present. How do you marry those two?
Great, thank you. Let's get some more questions. I think we have at the back here. Then you.
Hi, my name is Simone. I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute. My question's for Nathan, but the others, if you can weigh in, is how do you get researcher buy-in on, telling a story with their research? Because often one of the challenges that we find is that they feel that we're trying to dumb down or dilute their rigorous research, and we're saying, well, this is a way to get it out to your different audiences in a very compelling way, the policymakers or your donors. And so just some advice on getting them to buy in, to realize it's just a tool and it's not taking away from the rigorousness of their work, but actually just another way to get their work out to a wider audience. Thank you.
Great. Let's get some more questions. Yes, gentleman here.
My name is Jeremy, and I'm a research assistant here at the Wilson Center. And I'm curious, just in speaking about these sort of transmedia approaches to storytelling, distributing different stories across different media platforms, how access to the internet, I know that you mentioned it briefly in terms of the platform you developed for mapping online, but who gets to participate, who gets to see this media, and how does that impact its effectiveness?
Great, thank you. The lady behind you, and then the gentleman at the back in red.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm Allison Brisk. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center, and I have a question that's related to Deirdre's in a sense. I've just written a book that will be presented here October 24th called Speaking Rights to Power, and it's a comparison of 26 human rights